Well, hello everyone, and welcome to my new live stream with Dr. Tim Clark. Tim, it's great to have you with me.
Good to be with you, Margie. Thank you.
So you are, where did you say you're based, Tim?
Outside of Salt Lake City.
You're just outside Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
All right, beautiful. Well, are you in the mountains?
Right up against the mountains, yes.
Gorgeous. Well, that makes two of us today, given that I'm in Breckenridge. Not that I live here all the time.
Fantastic.
And I'm curious, anyone who is joining us, please feel free to let us know where you are as you're watching this now. I'm looking forward to talking with Tim today. I came across his book, which is this one here, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. Oh, I don't know, 6 months ago, I'm not quite sure. And it's by far the most it's the most relevant, the most useful, and it seems like the most intuitively logical framework for building psychological safety, but also beyond that, for really creating cultures in which we can be braver and we can encourage those around us to be braver, which is obviously the focus of my own work. And so, Tim, I'm curious to know, how did you find yourself working in an area around, building psychological safety, and came to the framework that you did and the 4 stages that you wrote about in this book?
Sure. Well, I've been working in the area of organizational culture for, 25 years, and studied that when I did my doctorate at Oxford. So I've been in this field both on the research side and the practitioner side for many, many years. And psychological safety is part of that, right? In fact, at this point, I would say that psychological safety is really the central indicator and the central measure of an overall culture. It tells us it's like taking the vital signs of a person. What do you take? You take their pulse and their blood pressure, right? This is the same thing for a culture. If you really want to know how a culture is doing, you take a look at their psychological safety. It's really the central indicator of the overall health and strength of a culture. And so I went back and I looked at all the research in the area, which goes back to 1965, and I realized, we're not done yet. If it's not a binary proposition, having psychological safety, and it's not do you have it or don't you have it? It's a matter of degree. Well, if it's a matter of degree, there has to be a pattern in the way that it increases. It can't be random. It can't be arbitrary. There's got to be a pattern. And so we started doing qualitative research in terms of interviews and observation. And then we started doing survey research, global survey research. And the pattern started to emerge. And so that's what got me into this topic. And I'm absolutely, totally captivated by it because it's not going away.
Yeah, no, I think actually with all of the disruption, all of the change, all of the uncertainty of this pandemic, it's actually upped the ante for those in leadership roles to foster that sense of psychological safety. And because there's been so much fear, and I think in some ways it's harder for people to forge meaningful connections when they're working remotely from their colleagues.
Yeah.
And there's not those same human touch points to sort of build. I'm curious to know how you think the different dynamics when it comes to that have been in play throughout the pandemic with people working remotely and not coming together, how they've impacted that sense of safety. And perhaps we should even just go back a step further and just say, how do you even define psychological safety?
I define it in 5 words: an environment of rewarded vulnerability. That's what it is. Because unless we can commit acts of vulnerability and have those acts of vulnerability rewarded instead of punished, then you really can't be yourself. You can't perform at capacity. You can't do any of the things that we need to do in organizations. You can't connect. You can't learn. You can't contribute. You can't innovate. You can't do any of that. So you need an environment of rewarded vulnerability. That's the definition.
And how do you think the pandemic has impacted and upped the ante for creating that environment?
Well, it's taken an enormous toll because as we work in organizations normally, if we're physically co-located, I mean, think about it. We have all kinds of interaction that goes on. There's formal and planned interaction and communication. And then there's informal and unplanned communication and interaction. Well, we just took most of that off the table, which actually constitutes the majority of the interaction and the communication that goes on in an organization. Most of it is informal. Most of it's unplanned. Yeah, we have meetings and we have a lot of planned stuff, but most of it's still unplanned and informal. So if you take that away, what do? You got to compensate for it. And this is where teams are struggling all over the world because they're trying to function virtually. They don't know how to do it. Some do because they were doing it before, or maybe they had a hybrid configuration. And so they kind of got used to it and they figured out how to do it. Most teams don't know how to do it. They've been thrust into this.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're trying to compensate for the absence, the lack, the removal of the informal, unplanned interactions. And they're struggling.
Yeah.
And so that's why people can very quickly, they can feeling disengaged and detached and isolated, and people are in trouble quickly, and the leader didn't even know. The leader's not equipped and not practiced, not skilled in creating that sense of community and connection and belonging with the team when it's all virtual. So many teams are struggling with this, I think, Margie.
Yeah. Yeah, those you mentioned that those teams that had already been in a hybrid model or working remotely, there was already a norm in place there.
Yeah.
But in terms of what can be done now, all right, we get it. A lot of leaders have struggled. A lot of people have struggled. We're clearly not out of this pandemic yet, but many people are going back to in-person working at least a few days a week. You know, that's on the, if not the immediate horizon, certainly in the months ahead, that's sort of the plan. What is it that you see great leaders doing that helps to create that environment of rewarded vulnerability?
Well, first of all, they're maintaining connection in a virtual environment. So, for example, here's kind of a best practice that we've seen is that if you're leading a team, you have at least minimum, at least one informal touch point with every team member once a week, and that's not even enough. Many team leaders are doing this once a day. So they're compressing the cycle time for touch points. And what we've learned is that a communication pattern that is frequent and brief is much more powerful than a communication pattern that is infrequent and long.
Yeah.
So the communication pattern is very, very, very important. So I would start with that. That's kind of the foundation. That communication pattern and that cycle time needs to be compressed. And then beyond that, building psychological safety is a matter of doing two things. Number one, you have to model acts of vulnerability yourself. Number two, you have to reward the acts of vulnerability committed by your colleagues and your team members. Those are the two mechanisms for increasing psychological safety on any team. There's no other way to get there.
Yeah.
There is no workaround. There is no shortcut. There's no backdoor. There's no other way to get there. You have to model acts of vulnerability yourself and then reward those acts of vulnerability in others. You have to do that.
Yeah. You know, I do a lot of work helping people to be braver, to be more vulnerable. And obviously it is a lot easier said than done, right?
Yeah, it is.
When it comes to role modeling vulnerability,
yeah.
You know, and many people struggle with that because, you know, there's that fear of exposure, that very primal instinct to protect our sense of identity, to protect our patch of dirt, to stay safe and secure in our sense of self. When you're working with leaders and you're saying, you've got to be role modeling vulnerability, and they're like, yes, okay, I'll put that on my to-do list for today.
Yeah.
How do you help those who sometimes struggle to do that, to find the courage to be vulnerable? Because to me, that's at the heart of it, is a real act of courage to lay our fear on the line there.
It is. So I think we kind of begin with the premise that the universal condition of the human family is that we're all insecure. So let's start with that premise. And then what makes it even harder is leaders, those who are in senior leadership positions, particularly, they're often wrapped up in their positions, in title, position, and authority. They're wrapped up. It's become so much of who they think they are. It's part of their identity. And so I try to help them understand that you need to detach from from those artifacts that the organization gave you. Title, position, authority, that's all they are. They're artifacts. So let's separate ourselves from those, and then you got to jump in with everybody else. So let's lose the bluster and the bravado and all of that nonsense that comes with position, and the social hierarchy, which gets in the way. Because with psychological safety, what are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to create a culturally flat organization. Why are we trying to do that? Because those things get in the way.
Yeah.
The power differential gets in the way. And when it gets in the way, that I can't perform at capacity because I don't feel that I'm in a safe environment. So what does that do? It triggers the pain centers of the brain. It triggers the self-censoring instinct. What am I going to do? Withdraw, retreat, recoil.
Yeah.
So how much of it, what do you get of me?
Yeah.
You get a small portion.
Yeah.
I'm playing defense. I'm not playing offense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is massive. I'm not going to release my full discretionary efforts. You're not going to get those until I'm convinced that I'm in an environment that rewards my acts of vulnerability.
Mm.
So you can't just go to people as a leader and say, be brave. That is, when leaders do that, I want you to be brave. I want your honest, candid, unedited feedback and input. If the environment of psychological safety is not there, that invitation is disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
It's nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
People are not going to respond to that. I want you to be brave. Please.
Yeah.
Your responsibility as a leader is to create the air cover for the candor.
Yeah.
And you've got to put that in place first. That's your stewardship. You are the cultural architect. And if you don't create those conditions, then, as I said, it's disingenuous of you to even ask. That's not good faith.
Yeah, it really undermines trust. And I think, to your point, just kind of starting from the premise that we are, as humans, insecure, and it's where really leadership, really good leadership, leaders who have the courage to do that and to be vulnerable themselves, it takes doing that inner work. It's really looking within themselves and going, what is it that I'm afraid of?
Yeah.
And where is it that I feel vulnerable, and I'm scared that if I do be vulnerable with others, that's going to come back and bite me. And I think when it comes to creating a whole cultural change with an organization, I've seen numerous change programs fail, and sometimes miserably. And often there's the CEO at the top that says, we want to be more agile and more innovative. And here they give it a really fancy name, the big change program, and rah, and the big talk. And then throughout, as you filter down through the different levels of an organization, there's a whole layer of people who are unwilling to reward vulnerability because they are unwilling themselves to lay their pride on the line. They just want to look good. So they don't want to hear any negative feedback, and they certainly don't want people being overly candid if it's critical. So in terms of, helping get that shift, if you're looking at doing a whole big change throughout a team or an organization, where do you start? Where do you start in terms of pulling the levers to getting that behavioral change?
Well, there's two places that you can start, but one is by far the best, and that's top down from those who hold positional power because they have scalable influence and impact. And so if they model the behavior, then that reverberates throughout the organization. They have the most influence in culture formation because they're modeling behavior, it ripples.
Yeah.
It ripples through the organization. They have the most influence in creating the prevailing norms of the organization. So that's ideal. And that's what we want is to just go top down and have them model and then reinforce the right norms. If that's not going to happen, then the only other way you can do it is what we call the model is beachhead change, where you try to establish a beachhead somewhere in the organization, and then you radiate from there. You're
Mhm.
moving laterally, you're moving vertically, you're trying to influence and radiate that influence any direction that you can. It's a lot tougher go,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
But if you're a leader and you lead a team, then you should be doing that anyway. You're trying to create a sanctuary of inclusion, right? Just your team and an incubator of innovation, kind of an enclave. And
Mhm.
then your team will start, and then you have to work cross-functionally, and it gets challenging
Yeah.
because every team has a micro culture, and then the cultures are different. And so sometimes you might have a healthy team, and then you might have a toxic team, but you're going to do your best wherever you are in the organization to spread that out, especially if it's a cultural transformation. But it's going to be more difficult to do that way
Mhm.
because ultimately you can't do a workaround senior leadership. Not possible.
No, no.
Organizations don't outperform their leaders, they reflect them. So
Yeah.
you're not going to kind of marginalize senior leadership and say we're going to do a workaround with senior leadership. That's not how it goes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are really your only two routes.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. There has to, and certainly from the top, you really want to have the leadership there fully on board and role modeling, but ensuring then alignment and accountability down through the ranks. Tim, I want to just go through with you fairly briefly for those who are listening. You have 4 steps or 4 sort of phases in terms of your framework for building psychological safety for that environment of rewarded vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I know we've already touched on that first one, which is that inclusion safety, that people feel a sense of belonging.
Mhm.
Um, if you want to just kind of take us then through what are the next 3 from there?
Sure. Well, just to summarize, yes, stage one is inclusion safety, which means you feel included, you feel accepted, you feel a sense of belonging. And that's the foundation. So you got to put the foundation in place. Otherwise, we don't pass go. We can't build that. If we don't have a foundation, we can't build on that. So that is stage one, inclusion safety. And it's stage one because, well, just as an example, in the survey research, 92% of employees worldwide, they said that's the need that we want to satisfy first
Yeah.
is the need to be included and accepted and belong. So that's why that is stage one. Then we go to stage two, which is learner safety. Learner safety means that you can engage in the learning process without fear that you'll be embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. So you can jump into asking questions and giving and receiving feedback and experimenting, even making mistakes. And you're not
Mhm.
going to get hammered for it.
Mhm.
Actually, you're going to be rewarded for it, right?
Yeah, for saying I don't know.
Yeah, and that's very important
Yeah.
because it, we know that learning is both intellectual and emotional, and you can't separate those two. And so as learners, we need that encouragement. We need those conditions of learner safety so that we can really flourish. So that's stage 2. And then we go to stage 3, which is contributor safety. Contributor safety means that you can take what you learn in stage 2, all of your knowledge and skills and abilities, and apply them to make a meaningful contribution, to make a difference, to have the opportunity to have some autonomy with guidance and encouragement, but to be able to do your part, to carry your weight. And that's what humans want to do. They want to make a difference. It's a very important part of identity. It's not just your demographic makeup, but it's also your ability to contribute. That is a very important part of our identity. Then we go to stage 4, the last stage, which is challenger safety. And challenger safety means that you can challenge the status quo without fear of retaliation or retribution. And this is the highest stage. And it reflects, or it protects you when you're engaging in what for many people is the riskiest act of vulnerability, which is to take on the status quo. That's a frightening thing. So that's the culminating stage. And that's also the domain. That is where we innovate. That's the realm of innovation. And it has to be, because innovation by its very nature requires that we disrupt the status quo, that we challenge it to make it better.
Yeah. You talked about earlier about providing air cover, and a concept that I often talk about, creating cultures of courage, which has a lot of overlay with this, but fostering that environment of loyal dissent. We're all on the same team. We're pulling together, and it's okay for you to disagree with my perspective and challenge my own thinking. And obviously that can be kind of confronting for people sometimes when someone's challenging their thinking. It's not always normalized.
Yeah.
But if I think about this, I'd like your opinion in the context of this time when there is such a sensitivity to different opinions in the bigger realm of, even the political realm and the social context here, where people can easily take offense. They can accuse people of microaggressions for saying things they don't like. Where the culture, the cancel culture that we live in, that if you say something someone doesn't like, you can run the risk of being cancelled, etc.
Yeah.
So when it comes to having that environment where we can debate heatedly different perspectives, and I might strongly disagree with the way you've gone about something, but doing that in a way that takes care of the humanity of the other person, that still treats them with respect. What do you feel that there is a lesson here for us, even outside of the realm of team and organization, but in our broader social connections and relationships and communities?
There's a huge opportunity for us because we're not doing very well on this sometimes, right?
Nope.
So let's go back to stage 1, inclusion safety. The point of view here is that inclusion safety is a human right. It's not something that you earn. It's something that you're owed by virtue of your humanity. And so if you're human and you don't present the team with the threat of harm, we are morally obligated to include you, to invite you into our society. So we have to maintain that as we move through the stages. And by the time we get to stage 4, challenger safety, what this means is that we can create a dynamic where we have extremely high intellectual friction, but we keep the social friction down. That is the defining characteristic of a world-class team. And we need to apply that same principle in society, in the public square. So what that means is we never abandon civility. We don't ever do that. So we're always respectful. We don't get personal. Will we have differences? Yes. We have to navigate and negotiate the differences. We have to acknowledge the differences. And we're not always going to get what we want. But we have to patrol the borders of respect so that It doesn't get personal,
Mhm.
because then what does that do? That elevates the social friction, and then it shuts down our intellectual friction. And we need the intellectual friction so that we can debate issues on their merits.
Mhm.
But we're human. And so we have a tendency to get defensive, take things personally, get temperamental. That's what we have to guard against. We have to be very, very careful here that we don't get personal, and we don't hopefully take things personally. So we have to extend grace to each other in the process. That's going to be very important. People will make mistakes. Hopefully we bring pure intent to our interactions. And if we have a point of view, we can express that in a respectful way. So we need our dialogue to be civil and respectful. That's how we maintain it, and that's how we're able to create and maintain the high level of intellectual friction that we
Mhm.
absolutely need. So let's take it even a step further. You said that we need to be able to dissent. That is not only necessary, it's absolutely critical for survival in a highly dynamic environment. The enemy is the homogenization of thought.
Mhm.
The enemy is creating an echo chamber of like-minded people. That's not going to help your organization when you're trying to create and sustain competitive advantage. We need to vocalize and verbalize our divergent thinking. We need a license to disagree and dissent. We need to be able to use it again and again and again. That means we need leaders that can handle that, right? That means we have leaders that bring incredible emotional intelligence, poise, composure. They let go of their ego defense mechanisms. They can handle the dissent. If
Mhm.
you're a leader and you can't handle the dissent, you're not going to last that long.
No, and you're going to do a lot of damage in the meantime too.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think that phrase where we have to patrol the borders of respect is a really powerful one. I sort of love the visual of that, because obviously, you know, in the, whether it's in organizational realms or in the larger societal realm and political realm, we often see that border being trespassed over,
Yeah,
and it creates obviously all sorts of polarization and division and mistrust, and which doesn't serve the organization, the entity, or society at large. And I think that's just a really powerful distinction to make there. Tim, just in finishing up with you, and there's obviously so much we could unpack here, and I really encourage people, if you're getting any aha moments listening to this, to pick up Tim Clark's book on the stages of psychological safety. But Tim, in just finishing up, obviously not everybody, some people will be listening to this and they don't manage a team, they don't
yeah,
manage an organization. They're just trying to manage their own lives, and they're trying to figure out, how do I ultimately be someone who thrives more and lifts up people as I go along, and avoids some of the potholes that can happen when you're in relationship with people. What's just one thing that you would encourage those who are listening to do, to be that ambassador for the world they want to live in, to be someone who does make it safe for others to speak openly around them? If there's, you know, if we kind of really boil this all down, what
yeah.
the simplest form is a behavior that we can exhibit more of?
Well, I appreciate you asking that question, Margie, because psychological safety is really about life. It's about humans interacting in any social setting, right? And we go from social setting to social setting in the course of a day as we interact with family and friends and work and any other social collective. So I would say to all of the viewers and the listeners out there that psychological safety is absolutely relevant and timely for you. And you, regardless of whether you think of yourself this way, you're a cultural architect too. You're radiating influence to your colleagues and your peers and your family members and whoever else you're interacting with. And so go back to the fundamental mechanisms. Are you modeling vulnerable behaviors yourself? And number two, are you protecting others when they do that?
Yeah.
If you can do those two things, you're going to cultivate and nurture psychological safety wherever you are in all of your relationships, and life's going to get better. Life's going to get better for you and for the people that you love and care about. So that's why psychological safety is something that we need to be concerned about, both in and outside of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in that way, each of us is a leader in our own way and in our own right, because each of us impacts how people around us feel. And, be the kind of person you'd want to hang out with and work with and live with. And I think taking sometimes that step back and having a look at where there are gaps, where do I not make it safe for others to be open? And where do I sometimes punish people or marginalize, even in the smallest way, when they may say things that I don't like to hear? Right. And I think, kind of coming back to that 101 of self-awareness, lead yourself first is pretty relevant in that context too.
That really is.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Tim. I appreciate your time, and you want to just acknowledge you for the awesome work that you do with leaders and organizations around the world, but and also just for the body of work that you've created, because it is so incredibly important and valuable now more than ever. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. So thank you. Take care and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Margie. It's been great to be with you.